What's up guys, Saf here on SuperSaf TV and welcome to another SuperSaf style camera comparison. This time between the Sony Xperia 1 and the Samsung Galaxy S10 Plus. The most requested on the channel recently, so a thumbs up for that would be appreciated. In the usual format, we'll be looking at front rear-facing cameras, images, video, low light, all of the good stuff. And right now we're starting off with the front-facing cameras. We are filming at 4K on the S10 Plus, which is capable of. We are at 1080p on the Xperia 1, so you can have a look. We've got a lot of light coming from the background, so this should test out the dynamic range quite well. Now, before we test out stabilization, we are going to switch to 1080p to make it fair on both devices. Right, now at 1080p from both devices. Also, I forgot to say, look out for the audio icon, so you'll know which device the audio is coming from. Let's go ahead and initially start with a walk. Now let's go ahead and run. Now we've switched to the rear-facing cameras. We're filming at 4K. Let's go ahead and test out the stabilization. Right, now what we'll do is see the different angles of view. So we'll try to zoom into those ducks there. Both devices can do up to 2 times optical zoom. Let's see if we can go into the wide angle as well. Right, so we can't actually go on to the ultra wide with the Xperia 1. That's an option that's not available, unfortunately. We can film with ultra wide. You can see that we are getting a lot more into our shots on the S10 Plus. That's interesting. We've just switched to 1080p on both devices, and this is just to test out the stabilization. Stabilization is usually better at 1080. Now just testing the autofocus on the Xperia 1. It's okay, not super fast. Same test on the S10 Plus, and it's noticeably faster. That was the video. Now before we move on to images, let's have a quick look at what we're working with here. For the rear-facing cameras, we have a very similar triple rear-facing camera setup with a primary camera, a telephoto camera that's going to give us 2 times optical zoom, as well as an ultra wide. Now the S10 Plus does have a slightly higher resolution for the ultra wide, and the primary camera also has a variable aperture where it's going to switch depending on the light in your scene. And for the front-facing cameras, the S10 Plus does have 2 front-facing cameras. The secondary camera is going to help with depth information for the selfie portrait mode. Now all images that you see have been taken on automatic, and that is to keep things as fair as possible. They do both have pro modes, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Starting off with some images outdoors of these flowers, both doing really good overall. Lots of detail, especially if you look towards the middle of this flower. The S10 Plus a little bit more vibrant, I would say, if you look at those greens. But overall, both are doing a good job. Now, I did have to tap the focus on the Xperia 1, and that's because it just would not focus on the flower automatically, so I did have to tap to do that, just to mention that there and keep things fair. Now moving on, here's an outdoor wide shot. We are shooting into direct sunlight, so looking at the dynamic range, I do once again think that the S10 Plus is slightly better. You do have more details in those shadows. Once again, a little bit more vibrant. You may or may not prefer that. Now testing out the ultra wide, and there is a big difference between these 2 images. Firstly, S10 Plus, much better dynamic range if you look towards the shadow areas. The S10 Plus has much better maintained those shadows. Once again, it is a lot more vibrant compared to the Xperia 1, and the Xperia 1 is slightly wider compared to the S10 Plus. If you look towards the bottom, it actually got the side of my finger in as well, so it is very, very wide, which you might like. Now I wanted to test out the optical zoom, so I went in front of this sign to see how close we could get to it. Here on the primary camera, once again, dynamic range easily goes to the S10 Plus. There's a lot of blown out clouds on the Xperia 1. And if we do use the telephoto camera, I think in terms of zoom, both are on par. But once again, dynamic range, the S10 Plus wins here. The Xperia 1 is blowing out those highlights in those clouds. Right now, testing out the portrait mode on both devices here, both seem to be doing a decent job, but the S10 Plus is definitely better. If you look towards my glasses, those edges have been maintained better, as well as the area in between my arm. And the dynamic range, once again, is better on the Samsung. If you look towards the background, you can still see some of that blue in the sky, whereas that has been blown out on the Sony. Now, I was wearing a cap in this picture, which would probably make it a little bit easier to cut around, so I thought I'll take it off. And here in this image, you can see that the Sony is really struggling. My hair is now all a blur. It's actually now missed out a lot of chunks in between my arms, whereas the Samsung is doing much better here. And I thought I'd do one last test for portrait mode. And again, it's obvious here that dynamic range better on the S10 Plus, and edge detection so much better. The Xperia seems to have completely ignored the section in between my arms, whereas the Samsung has taken care of that. And around my face and ears as well, the Sony has really struggled, whereas the Samsung has done a much better job. So when it comes to portrait mode, the Samsung clearly winning here. Right, now I thought I'd go into some more challenging lighting situations. So here is a chocolate fudge cake, which was absolutely delicious. And the S10 Plus maintaining a lot more detail in those shadows. It has become very, very dark towards that chocolate cake area on the Sony. And then I went and took a picture of this light. Sony has blown it out, so dynamic range really does not seem to be on point on the Sony. The Samsung, it's actually exposed it very, very well. Moving on to low light. So here's a shot that I took on auto on both devices, and the Samsung, much brighter, has maintained a lot more detail in those darker areas. And it doesn't stop there, because on the S10 Plus, if you've got the Exynos version anyway, the new update does allow night mode, which lets in a lot more light. And here you can see that it's night and day difference. The Samsung looks like it's almost been taken in daylight, which is very interesting. Went out, took another shot in low light. Here, once again, the S10 Plus doing so much better. The Xperia 1 is struggling to even keep focus on this sign, whereas the S10 Plus has absolutely no problem. Once again, if you do use the night mode on the S10 Plus, we're going to get a much brighter image. Final test in low light, S10 Plus, again, much better. The Xperia 1 has a bit of a green tint to it, and it's not as bright as the S10 Plus. And once again, if you do use that night mode, then it really does brighten up the image quite a bit, and it's a much, much better image compared to the Xperia 1. Right, now let's have a look at some selfies. So this is a selfie taken in good light, both actually doing a really good job. The Xperia 1 is slightly wider compared to the S10 Plus, but generally speaking, I like the colors on both of these. The sharpness is also on point of both of these, so I'd call this one a bit of a draw. Now I wanted to test that dynamic range, so I went in front of the sunlight, and here the Sony is actually doing a better job. It's done a good job of balancing the foreground as well as the background, and everything is well exposed, whereas the S10 Plus is struggling a little bit. Although the background seems to be well exposed, I am very, very dark here in the foreground. Now testing out some portrait selfies, the Xperia 1 is struggling a lot here. Firstly, the dynamic range that we talked about in the previous shot has completely gone out the window here, and the sky is now overexposed, and the edge detection is very, very bad towards my jacket as well as my face. And I know a lot of you guys are going to say it's because of the sunglasses that this has happened, but the S10 Plus has done a great job. Edge detection is on point. Yes, that's going to be partly thanks to that secondary front-facing camera, but dynamic range as well is on point. It's not blown anything out like the Xperia 1 has. Now, just to make things fair, I did take my sunglasses off and I took this shot here. Once again, the S10 Plus doing much better here. The Xperia 1 struggling with dynamic range. It looks like as soon as you put on that portrait selfie, then HDR is just non-existent. And the edge detection is also really bad. If you look towards my arm, you can see that there's lots of defects. My ear is blurred, and it's just nowhere near as good as what we've got in the S10 Plus. Now some low light selfies. The S10 Plus is a little bit brighter. The Xperia 1, it's got a bit of a tint to it. It's gone a bit too warm for my liking, so I do prefer the S10 Plus here. However, if you do use the front-facing flash, then I do prefer the Xperia 1. The S10 Plus does have more noise, and it has washed things out a little bit. And there we have it, guys. I don't know what to say. You guys know that I'm completely honest and unbiased in my videos, and I have to be completely honest with the Xperia 1 and say that I'm very disappointed with the results. You guys saw all of the results. I've also spoken to a lot of my YouTuber friends who've been using the Xperia 1, and they've had a very, very similar experience. I mean, if you look at all of the different tests, the S10 Plus just performed better, whether that was dynamic range, low light, portrait mode, video from the front as well as the rear-facing cameras. I think the only area where the Xperia 1 was better was when it came to dynamic range from the front-facing camera for regular shots, not portrait mode shots, just regular shots. Now both devices do support HDR video. I couldn't do that for this test because the rest of the video isn't shot in HDR and you'd need an HDR display for it too. And the Sony does have manual control over video using the Cinema Pro app. This is something that you don't have available on the S10 Plus. So if you are somebody who wants to manually go and configure things, then the Sony might be an interesting option for you. But when it comes to shooting the camera as it is, which most people do, then the S10 Plus is the clear winner here. Now, as I was saying, I did have lots of hopes for the Xperia 1, but it seems like Sony keep making the same mistakes over and over again. They actually make amazing hardware. If you look at the S10 Plus, if you look at the iPhone XS Max, if you look at any flagship smartphone out there, it's most likely going to be using a Sony sensor. Sony make the best sensors out there. They also make amazing cameras. I use the Sony a7 III on a regular basis, but hardware is just half of the picture. You do need to have good software processing to go along with it. Google is the perfect example. Look at the Google Pixels. They might have just regular hardware, but when it comes to the software processing, they do an amazing job. And this is where the Sony Xperia 1 is definitely failing, maybe more than what we had in previous years. So the Sony Xperia team, if you're watching this, then please improve the software processing on your devices. This is something that so many of the manufacturers are doing really well now. Look at the S10 Plus, look at the iPhone XS Max, look at the Google Pixels. Have a look at what all of these other guys are doing and try to also bring that to your Xperia devices. But as it stands right now, I can't recommend the Xperia 1 based on its cameras. Maybe we'll see some improvements with software. We'll have to wait and see. But right now, I'm pretty disappointed, to be honest. That's what I think anyway. What do you guys think? Definitely drop me a comment below and let me know your thoughts. If you want to see lots of images from lots of different devices, then do give me a follow on Instagram. I'm at SuperSaf. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, then do hit that thumbs up button for me. And if you haven't already, then be sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon so you don't miss any further coverage. Thanks for watching. This is Saf on SuperSaf TV, and I'll see you next time.